Hey guys, so we're looking at a video from Historia Civilis, and this one's called Macedonian Battle Tactics, which we did touch a lot from Kings and Generals, especially his Alexander the Great series. Though I'm really looking forward to learning more because for those of you who are new or don't fully know or aren't aware of this, the Greeks are my favorite civilization and group to learn from. My favorite culture, my favorite history, and my favorite era is definitely the rise of Philip and Alexander, all the way through the Hellenistic age until, the Romans rose and stopped that. Um, so that time period is my favorite in terms of culture, history, and battle tactics, because my favorite weapon of all weapons in history is the pike. And I don't know what is it about the pike, but something about pikes are just so cool to me, especially obviously they're a formation weapon. Like a lone pikeman just looks silly. Just a dude with a giant stick. But you bring like a group of them together and it instantly becomes this wall of death. And we do know that, with that said, my favorite battle formation is the phalanx, more specifically the Macedonian phalanx, that utilize the sarissa, the two-handed pike, um, which exceeded the previous Greek phalanxes in that it needed two hands. The pike was much longer, and with that weapon, the Hellenistic age, the Greeks basically ruled the world and were the strongest forces until the Romans and other forces eventually defeated them and took over. But again, this is definitely my this is a video that I'm really looking forward into seeing a different perspective of the weapon and the tactics that were used. I guess the biggest one is definitely the hammer and anvil strategy, because the phalanx, as it was meant to be used, the Macedonian phalanx, it was more meant to keep the enemy pinned while the cavalry got the victory. Like Alexander would destroy the wings with his companions and then crash upon the enemies that were engaged with the phalanx. So again, it's been called the hammer and the hammer anvil tactics, and it's very heavily tied with Alexander. So I'm really looking forward to this, though I don't want to leave Philip II of Macedon out because a lot there's a saying, Philip walked so Alexander could run. Like, Philip is definitely the guy who pioneered the weaponry, the army, and the tactics that Alexander would go on to utilize and change and evolve. So, definitely I want to give credit to Philip because he also was a genius. So, yeah, if you want to watch the original video by the great Historia Civilis without me here in the corner talking, the link to this video is down in the description down below. And if you want to help me out and support my channel in any way, shape, or form, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. It would really help my very small but humble channel grow, and I would appreciate it a lot. Now, with that said, and now without any further ado, let's get to it, shall we? Let's learn Macedonian battle tactics by Historia Civilis. Alexander the is there supposed to be volume? Wait.
The person.
Okay. There doesn't seem to be volume at the beginning. I was afraid my computer was having a problem. Oh, that scared me. I was like, what's wrong with my computer? It's like, why can't I hear anything? Okay. Okay, volume is definitely gonna come in. Must have had a copyright issue or something. Because if usually when YouTubers mute the beginning of their videos, it's because of copyright music and wanting to get rid of it. So maybe Historia Civilis had that problem. I would know. I've done it before, too. Okay, Philip giving money to the military, then he died. Okay, when does the volume kick in, though?
The Macedonians
Okay, we're almost there.
called their cavalry the Companions, or the Companion Cavalry. During this period, most Western armies had a really narrow conception of the proper use of cavalry. Many trained them to harass the enemy by throwing javelins or shooting arrows. Others used them as scouts or skirmishers, but beyond that, their use was limited. The Macedonians ignored this conventional wisdom. The Companion Cavalry specialized in charging the enemy flanks and inflicting massive casualties up close with their swords and spears. Despite what the movies may tell you, this was rare in the ancient world. You could even say that it was unintuitive. Stirrups hadn't been invented yet, and many people, including the Macedonians, didn't even use saddles.
Wow.
A person could get knocked off their horse by a stiff breeze. To many, charging straight into a mass of humanity seemed suicidal.
Dang, I did not know that. They didn't have saddles and stuff for the horses? Dang, they were like holding on for dear life at points, right? To not fall off. I've never heard that before. So when did the saddle start being utilized? That's crazy to me. I got on a horse once, and I was nervous. And that horse had a saddle. Like, I can't imagine not being on a on a saddleless horse. And when I was on the horse, I was like beyond scared. And when I got off, that horse ran, and I have a vivid memory of it running across the beach. And I was like, dang, that could have been me. I would have fallen off. I was a little kid. I was like 4 when that happened. And I just remember thinking, dang, if I were on that horse when it booked it, I would have fallen and died, you know? So, yeah, that's crazy. And, like, they're doing it with this weaponry, and, like, dang. I'm sorry I'm putting a lot of emphasis on this. I've never heard that before. I just assumed the saddle was as old as horse riding itself, but that makes it even this more braver, actually. Because, yeah, they could have gotten knocked off easily. That makes sense why the cavalry wasn't as... I guess it was rare for them to be as violent as they were. That is unique.
But the Macedonians knew what they were doing. For instance, the spears they used were quite interesting. They were made to be as light and as thin as possible. So thin that the wooden spear wobbled as they charged. They were about 12 feet long and were held near the center. Both ends of the spear had metal tips, so if one end broke, all the rider had to do was flip the spear around and continue fighting with the other end. If that end broke as well, they had a sword to use as backup. Obviously, these spears weren't designed to crash into the enemy line. That would have shattered the spear and knocked the rider off the horse. The spear was designed to make lightning-quick stabs while on the move. This was hard to do, but the companions were expertly trained and were quite deadly with them.
I see. So it's not meant to be like a crouch weapon, it's meant to be like a jab. Okay. Alright, that's interesting.
So all of this made the companions pretty distinct in the ancient world, but they also organized themselves in a strange way. When they charged, they didn't do it in a line like you'd think. They charged as a wedge.
Yes, there are several unique ways that I can think of that Greeks charge. I think the Thessalonian cavalry was kind of unique in the diamond formation that they would get into. The Thessalonians were known as some of the best cavalry units of the Greeks, and they had this diamond formation that they charged in, and apparently this diamond formation would be really helping breaking through an enemy with greater force. So I guess that principle kind of applies here with the wedge, right?
There's a reason for this. When cavalry charges in a line, they have a tendency to do this. When the Macedonian wedges charged, they could do this.
Oh, wow.
Here's why. The person at the tip of the wedge was the guy in charge. Since everyone could keep an eye on their leader, the entire unit could basically receive orders non-verbally. This meant that they could wordlessly change directions mid-gallop, or specifically target vulnerable enemy units with surgical accuracy.
That is cool.
When they made contact with the enemy, any opening made by the riders at the front could immediately be exploited by the riders further back. As a result, the wedges were capable of creating chaos and cutting deep into the enemy line. A well-timed charge like this could single-handedly win a battle.
That is so cool, dude.
But no matter how successful the cavalry were, the opportunities they created needed to be followed up by infantry. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For this to make sense, we need a rock-solid understanding of what a phalanx was. If we're talking phalanxes, we're talking spears. Dudes holding spears maybe 8 feet long, with big circular shields. A phalanx was a group of these spearmen organized into a tight square. In battle, they presented a solid shield wall, bristling with spears. Since there were so many people packed into the square, and everybody in the square was so well trained, the phalanxes had an intense forward momentum. Against less disciplined opponents, they were nearly unstoppable. But they had vulnerabilities. They were slow as hell, both slow to move and slow to turn. Plus, since the entire phalanx had to work together, they were pretty bad at fighting in 2 directions at once. This made them vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. When 2 opposing phalanxes met on the battlefield, the 2 squares would lock shields and push against each other as hard as they could.
Yeah, that's the way that the Greek phalanxes fought. A lot of it was more kind of like a push, like he just mentioned. That's kind of the optimal word you would use to describe them. And it was more like a tug of war in a sense. Like they would push each other until one side would kind of break, and then whichever side broke and routed first, and that's where the real casualties would mount up in the retreat. Yeah, I think that's the way that the Greeks did it with the shields, the heavy shields and stuff. Well, what made the Macedonian phalanx unique is that they got rid of the heavy shield and the heavy armor, and the Macedonians wore what, this lemur armor, like definitely, you know, less heavy than what we think of like the hoplites of the Spartans or Athenians. And they had a shield, but it's a really small pelta shield that they would put over their neck, because their sarissa pikes required 2 hands. They couldn't hold a heavy shield and the sarissa pike. So this like pelta shield they would put over their like you know, like neck, and it would like be on their left arm, I think. And so they would be really close together, so they wouldn't have to actually hold it. The shields were definitely smaller though, but you know, that was the idea. And they can devote both of their hands to wielding the sarissa. And obviously, the longer the spear, the better, so that's why I was able to defeat the hoplites and phalanxes of old. And, yeah.
This would basically take both of the phalanxes out of commission for a while, and the shoving would continue until one side lost their footing, or another group showed up to tip the balance. Phalanxes were all the rage in Greece for the century or...
Yeah, like, I think the phalanx... I think the oldest phalanx, when I was looking it up, was attributed to the Sargon of Akkadon, or the Akkadon Empire, as one of the earliest phalanxes in history. But despite that, I feel like the phalanx, when most people think of it, it's more tied to Greece, which is funny because, you know, Greece is known for its mountainous, you know, geography. So the phalanx requiring more flat ground, it's like, oh, why did the Greeks develop a fighting style considering their region? They would obviously meet at flatter places to fight, but I don't know, it is kind of a funny thought, right, to have like, unique fighting style they kind of were known for, considering their geography, right?
To preceding Philip's reign, the entire peninsula was basically going through one giant phalanx arms race. For the longest time, Macedon didn't have phalanxes. The Macedonians were able to survive on the strength of their excellent cavalry, but the infantry side of things was kind of ignored. When Philip came to power, he busied himself with a bunch of reforms and introduced phalanxes.
Yeah, Philip, I think, was a hostage, I think is the word they'd use, to the Thebans, I believe. And the Thebans at the time before the rise of Philip and Macedon were kind of the top dogs, because the Thebans and their sacred band had defeated the Spartan hegemony, and you know, they kind of broke Sparta. And so Philip studied them and learned from them, and then implemented his own change. I just love how the evolution of the phalanx was eventually who's gonna get the larger, more pointier stick, and it just like, you know, Philip, like a genius, he's like, what if we just made the stick longer? And yeah. Obviously there's way more to it than that, but like I kind of joke, like if the phalanx had just kept going, eventually the sarissas would have become comically larger, and it would require like 2 guys to hold a sarissa. I'm joking, obviously, but I like to think, oh, you know, maybe that's what would have happened.
Phalanxes to Macedon. He gave these new units a new prestigious name, the Foot Companions. Through Philip's leadership, they would become the backbone of the Macedonian army. The Foot Companions were modeled after the Greek phalanx, but were new and improved. They used a new kind of spear called the sarissa. Technically, sarissas might be pikes rather than spears, but whatever, let's not be sticklers to detail. This weapon was usually 14 or 18 or sometimes even 20 feet long. It was basically twice as long as the spears they used in Greece. So what did this mean? Well, if you can picture 2 phalanxes marching at each other, the one with the longer spears would always draw first blood, and would therefore have the advantage. Plus, the sarissas were so long that people 3 or 4 or 5 rows back could still reach the enemy with their spears. If you compare this with the Greek phalanx, the Macedonians were able to get double or triple the number of spears attacking at once, with no additional manpower.
Genius. And the unique way that it's presented is that obviously the first few lines have their sarissas pointed forward, and the back lines, you see, they rise higher. And I've heard people say that the reason the back lines raised them higher was, you know, to kind of shield or shadow what was going on behind the phalanxes with the rest of the army, and also to catch projectiles that were being thrown at them. So I don't know, that's unique. Dude, I wish I could go back in time and just see a sarissa, you know, Macedonian phalanx in action. I would give anything to travel in time and just witness like a phalanx battle like this. It's my favorite battle formation, my favorite weapon, just everything about it I love, you know?
But the sarissas came with a downside. They were absurdly long, and it took an equally absurd amount of training to be able to use them effectively. Unlike normal spears, the sarissas had to be held with both hands. To accommodate this, the Macedonians shrunk down their shields and made them into tiny 18-inch bucklers, which could be strapped to each man's upper arm and used to deflect incoming spears. To get the untrained Macedonian infantry comfortable with this new weapon, they had to be drilled and drilled and drilled at a huge cost. But in the end, it was worth it. Once they were in the field, the Foot Companions were basically elite phalanxes, better trained and better equipped than their Greek counterparts.
That's another thing, like, definitely there is a lot of training to go involved in this, and I don't want to, like, sound like I'm playing it down, but, like, Philip could train, like, you know, regular people, like herdsmen and stuff, and mold them into an elite fighting force through this formation and weapon, you know? That people with lack of special training individually, once thrown into a phalanx, would become a part of a death machine, essentially, of giant, you know, spears and pikes. So again, like, definitely could turn out much more deadly soldiers through that, much quicker, in a sense. Though, obviously, as you mentioned, this required all training and a lot of drilling to really master, but, still. It's kind of like when you think of, like, the Swiss pikeman and a medieval knight. Like, by comparison, the Swiss pikeman required and did a lot less training than a medieval knight who was from, like, childhood on up, and eventually, like, the Swiss pikeman beat the knight. You could get, like, more normal people and just throw and train them in the Swiss pikeman kind of way, and they would as a whole unit would overcome a knight. So it's kind of like that idea, you know what I mean? So yeah.
But all of the training in the world couldn't change the fact that it was incredibly hard for all phalanxes, including these new foot companions, to respond quickly to a changing battlefield. They still had all of the weaknesses of—
Yeah, that's the thing. As much as I'm glazing the phalanx, its biggest disadvantage was that it wasn't agile or mobile. It could not adapt as quickly, and it needed great terrain. Like, the terrain needed to be perfect for the phalanx to work. If they're fighting on rough terrain, instantly the weaknesses and the formation would be thrown off, and then cracks would start to form, and that's how the Romans beat it. And obviously, if you find a way to hit it from the rear or the flank, instantly it falls apart too. Another way that the Romans beat the phalanx, they managed to get behind it or attack the flank, and then just everything else falls apart. So definitely a lack of adaptability, and the conditions, like the ground terrain, need to be perfect for it to actually be of optimal use. That's why, Alexander needed his silver shield and a lot of, support, because the phalanx on its own isn't gonna be effective. It was a part of a combined arms weapon system, the cavalry, utter elite infantry to protect the flanks, like the silver shields, and the phalanx was a part of something whole. And again, the phalanx wasn't the main offensive. Like, a part of it, like I mentioned earlier, it was supposed to be the anvil to the hammer. It was meant to keep enemies pinned while, the cavalry swooped down and stuff. So again, just a phalanx on its own isn't gonna, it needs a lot of support too.
a normal phalanx. They were still slow and still vulnerable to getting flanked. When a bunch of phalanxes were lined up, the units at each end of the line were exposed. Here, Philip placed a new kind of infantry, called the shield bearers. The shield bearers were outfitted in a much more traditional Greek style, with a shorter, more manageable spear and a large shield. They also carried swords. Since they weren't weighed down with the giant unwieldy sarissa, the shield bearers were much more versatile than the foot companions. They were the Macedonian army's utility players. They could fight as a regular phalanx, or they could spread out. They could quickly redeploy on the battlefield, or totally break formation and charge. They could fight with a spear or with a sword. If you ever hear about the Macedonians doing anything weird, like fighting on uneven ground, or breaching walls, or scaling cliffs, it was the shield bearers who did it. These units were entirely made up of veteran soldiers, men with long and distinguished careers, plucked from the foot companions and given a place of honor on the flanks. Under normal circumstances, these units were supposed to hold back and leave the intense fighting to the foot companions. The shield bearers were kind of like a reserve force, except Philip's innovation was to put his reserves on the exposed flanks, which is kinda genius. When the enemy line began to falter, the shield bearers were sent in. They could move much faster than the foot companions, and their looser way of fighting was better for dealing with a retreating enemy.
Yeah, definitely. I do believe that's where the Silver Shield veterans and units kind of were part of this group. I could be wrong about that. But yeah, you definitely see just how, they needed to be at the flanks to protect the phalanx, the main phalanx, and, were versatile to move on their own. So that's something really cool about them, you know?
Now all of the pieces are in place. Let's see how they worked together. The most well-known Macedonian tactic is called the hammer and anvil. You may have heard of this. It's super famous. With the hammer and anvil, it was the infantry's job, in this case the foot companions, to engage the enemy and hold them in place. They were the anvil. It was the cavalry's job to swing around and attack the enemy from behind. They were the hammer. The whole thing relied on the speed and effectiveness of the hammer, and the reliability of the anvil. The whole point of this tactic was to quickly envelop the enemy, and force them to face attacks from two directions at once. If the enemy wanted to break the encirclement, they either had to go through the foot companions, who were basically one giant unstoppable meat grinder, or go through the companion cavalry, who happened to be one of the most effective cavalry units in human history. It's simple, but it's extremely effective. Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae used this tactic against the Romans with astounding success, but we'll cover other famous examples in the near future.
Yep, definitely. And you just have to see definitely a lot of it. I mean, it's all a combined arms thing. Everyone needs to play their part and do their part well. The main phalanx needs to not break. Meanwhile, you know, the companions need to be effective and swift and whatnot. But yeah, you need great cavalry for sure. And the companions were one of the best cavalry units in history. And Hannibal's Numidians were also incredibly great. So again, cavalry is very OP, guys. You know?
Future. Before Philip's reign, Macedon did not have reliable infantry. They were able to get by because of their excellent cavalry, but nobody ever bothered to invest the time and money to bring the infantry up to the Greek standard. Philip changed this. Through his leadership, he not only met the Greek standard, but exceeded it. At the time of his death...
And that's why Philip united basically the Greek world under the Macedonian banner, you know? Because, yeah, the man was a genius and basically brought Greece together.
Macedon was still a regional power, but thanks to Philip, it could now field a world-class army.
Another great video from Historia Civilis. Again, I love this. I love learning about Macedonia and their battle tactics. I have to give a lot of praise to Philip for coming up with them, and for Alexander for, you know, making his own adjustments and using it to its fullest potential. Overall, another great video, my friends. And I'll end it right here, and tomorrow we'll start something new. Bye, everyone.